All right, this here is the Ghostly Avenger. In the southern part of West Virginia, there's a gravestone with the following inscription: Sacred to the memory of Jim Brown. There is no date. No epitaph, because Jim Brown was hanged. This is the story. At the close of the Civil War, a company of federal soldiers was stationed in Marion County. Charles Murphy was a lieutenant in this company. His brother, who was an officer quartered in a neighboring county, was sent one day to receive funds for the payment of some men. After he had received the money, he set out again, planning to return to his troops by evening. The night Charles Murphy was awakened by a violent flapping of his tent. It sounded as if a gale was coming. But when he arose to make sure that the pegs and poles of his tent were secure, the noise ceased, and he was surprised to find that the air was calm. When he returned to bed, the flapping began again, and this time he dressed himself and went outside to make a better examination. Now, in the shadow of a nearby tree, a man stood beckoning. It was his brother. In a low, grave voice, he told Charles to follow him. The lieutenant walked swiftly through the woods for some time with his brother until they descended a slope to the edge of a swamp, where he stumbled against something. Now, looking down at the object on which he had tripped, he saw it was his brother's corpse, not newly dead, but cold and rigid. The pockets had been rifled and the clothing was soaked with mire and blood. Dazed and terrified, he returned to camp, where he roused some of his men. At daybreak, they secured the body. It was not long before evidence turned up that brought about the arrest of Jim Brown. There was a hint that his responsibility for the crime was revealed through the same supernatural being that had warned Lieutenant Murphy. Now, Brown was an ignorant farmer who hated Yankee soldiers and who had been excited by learning the officer was carrying money. He had offered to take his victim by a shortcut to his camp, but took him into the swamp instead, where he shot him and robbed him. All right, this one here is Darkish Knob. Near the town of Parsons, West Virginia, there's a tall, steep hill covered almost entirely with loose rock. Only one path leads over this hill, and it is almost impassable. The hill is called Darkish Knob. Now, during the Civil War, the Underground Railroad was bringing as many Negro slaves as possible to the north, where they would be free. Now, these slaves had to travel by night so they wouldn't be seen, and they would hide at different houses during the day. They could not travel the same routes many times because the authorities would wait there to capture them. One of the most favored areas to travel through was the mountainous region of West Virginia. There were many hiding places, but traveling by night was extremely dangerous. The few trails that the Negroes dared to travel were so perilous that few people would attempt them by day. Now, one of the resting places for these fugitives was a house in a valley at the foot of Darkish Knob. It was well hidden by the mountains on all four sides. In fact, the valley was so very well hidden that the Negroes themselves often could not find it. Now, a young Negro girl was trying to locate this place one dark night. She was being chased by men her owner had hired to catch his runaway slaves. She missed the valley and started up the path over Darkish Knob. Her horse was very tired, but she pushed him on harder. Now, the top of this hill dropped straight down to Cheat River. As she reached the top, she turned to look back. Her horse lost his footing, and both horse and rider rolled down the hill and hit the sharp rocks in the river. As the girl dropped, her scream was heard for miles. This hill has been known as Darkish Knob since that time. Now, the girl's ghost is said to have returned to the top of this hill every year on the eve of the date of her death. It chants and moans over the death just as the Negro people once did when one of their people died. At exactly the instant of the fatal plunge, the ghost screams loud and long. The young people in this area say that the chanting and moaning is only the wind in the trees. They also say that the scream is that of a wildcat. But the older generation know that this is the ghost of the young Negro girl. All right, this one is called A Slave Boy's Revenge. It was very late at night as young Kurt, a slave boy, slipped through the fence surrounding the small dirt-floored shack. He was forced to call his home. After a very hard day in the fields, he decided he could stand it no longer. He was willing to risk death itself rather than continue life under these wretched conditions. He made his break through the open fields and into the woods unseen. His break was not discovered until the next morning. Upon learning of the boy's escape, the master immediately went for his bloodhounds, which quickly picked up the trail and sped, barking into the woods. Now Kurt, being on foot, had been unable to cover a great distance, even though he had several hours head start. When he heard the hounds in the distance, he decided to backtrack to a swamp near the plantation. As he neared the swamp, the dogs had closed the gap to just a few hundred yards. He began to run with all his strength across an open field that lay between him and the swamp. He was caught by the dogs in the center of the field and was badly torn up by the time the master got to him, but he was still very much conscious. As the master arrived, he called off the dogs, and in front of many a watching slave, for the field was in sight of the huts, he drew his sword and with one mighty blow cut off the young boy's head. After that, the master couldn't sleep, for he kept hearing strange sounds, as if someone was trying to enter his bedroom. This went on for several nights. One night he heard the voice of the young boy he had brutally killed. He began following it and eventually was led back to the field where he had killed young Kurt. Some of the slaves saw him as he passed. Suddenly a loud scream was heard. As the rest of the whites rushed into the field, they saw a horrible sight. The master lay dead in the same spot where Kurt had lain. To their surprise, they noticed he had no head, and beside the body lay the very same sword he had used to murder the slave boy. There were no tracks to be picked up by the dogs, and the mystery was never solved. All right, this one here is called Frist House. Now, during the Civil War, Hardy County was one of the few counties in West Virginia to go Confederate. Now, the reason Hardy turned rebel was that several well-to-do farmers in the county used slave labor. The only important person opposed to the Confederacy was John Frist, an influential man who lived in a large house outside of Moorfield. Because of John's resistance, a group of hot-headed rebels went to his house one night and murdered him, his wife, and their 3 children. After this, John Frist's home was used as a prison for runaway slaves who were caught. Now the slaves would be taken into the basement of the house, chained to the wall, and left for dead. Those who performed these acts of insanity were called the McNeil Rangers, and they operated out of Moorfield. Now after the South's surrender, the slaves in Hardy County were released, all except the ones who had died in the cellar of their prison. Now a group of townspeople went to the Frist house and cleared out the bones and decaying bodies. This house is still standing and is in very good condition. Several families have owned or rented it since the end of the Civil War, but none of them has remained in it for more than a year. I know of 5 families, all from other places, that have owned it in my lifetime. Now the families that have lived there claim that once a year, on the anniversary of the Frist family's murder, blood appears on the floor and walls of the room in which they were killed. It slowly wears off during the year, but it can't be painted over or sanded out. Also, strange screams and the sound of chains rattling come from the cellar. All my life, I have heard that this house is haunted. I hope it does not carry a curse, because my parents rented it for a few months, about a year after they were married, and I was born there. Now this one here is the murdered prisoner's ghost. Now about 1900, the Hall family lived near a so-called haunted hollow on a farm in Pendleton County. Their house was on one side of a dirt road, and on the other side stood 2 hills with a hollow between them. Now, about halfway up the hollow stood an old log cabin. Now, the story was told that the log cabin in the hollow was used as a jail during the Civil War. One day, an inmate dressed in white, probably his underwear, tried to escape. He ran as far as one of the hills, but was shot. Blood poured out of his right leg and stained his white pants. He reeled around, stretching forth his arm in a gesture of surrender, but was shot in the other leg. Blood also poured from his left leg. He was carried into the cabin, dead. It is not known whether he was buried or not. But as the years passed, the cabin decayed, the roof fell in, and the area around it was grown over with brush. But when people passed by the cabin, they could hear the cries of anguish and moaning. When Miss Hall moved into this area, she knew the hollow was supposed to be haunted, but she did not know the story of the prisoner. Now, the Hall family grazed their cattle on one side of the hill, and it was Miss Hall's chore to bring them home every evening. Now, one evening, a few cattle strayed up beyond the cabin. In taking a shortcut, Miss Hall passed the cabin and heard the moans. She was not a woman to be easily frightened and called out in a loud voice, "I've heard there are ghosts in this hollow. If you're a ghost, come out. I'm not afraid. And if you're a man, come out. I'm still not afraid." But the noise that followed did frighten her. Hearing a loud rumbling as if someone were removing debris, she ran down the hill towards her nearest neighbors. As she ran, she turned to see a man dressed in white, with two blood-stained legs, standing on the hill with his arm raised. She finally arrived at her neighbor's house and told of her experience. Now the woman then related the legend, and upon hearing this, Miss Hall fainted. Mr. Hall was sent for to take his wife home, and as they passed the foot of the hollow on their journey homeward, Miss Hall fainted again. The strain of living in that location was so great for Miss Hall that the family was forced to move. All right, you guys, this one here is called the Coal Mountain Light. Now, outside of Moorefield, West Virginia, stands Coal Mountain. This area was the scene of a strange happening back in the mid-1800s. Now, Charles Jones, a large landowner, took one of his most faithful slaves and went coon hunting one night. The slave was carrying a lantern that provided the two with some light while they were following the voices of the dogs. Suddenly, the dogs began barking more fiercely. Since this meant they probably had treed a coon, Charles and the slave both took off, running in the direction of the barking. Now, the slave was younger and stronger than his master, so he led with the lantern. When he arrived at the place where the dogs were, he discovered that the master was nowhere in sight. The boy, who was a loyal friend as well as a faithful servant, waited for a while and then went searching for his master. He hunted all through the night and the next morning, but could find no trace of his friend. Now, overcome by fear, the slave went back to the house to inform the Jones family of the incident. Miss Jones organized a search party made up of friends and neighbors, and this group, led by the slave, covered the mountain thoroughly. After a whole week of searching, in which they hadn't found Jones or any sign of him, they gave up. Now, the slave was never accused of harming the missing man, for everyone knew how devoted he was to his master. The boy kept on searching after the others stopped. Exactly 1 year to the night after his master had disappeared, the slave took his lantern and left for a final search. He was never seen again. But on certain nights, the people who lived around Coal Mountain said they could see his lantern still patrolling the mountain. They said that after the night the slave disappeared, his lantern light slowly changed from yellow to a bright red. Even today, people still see the light, especially those who live around Moorefield. Some of them have had strange experiences with it. Charles Allen, a former teacher at Moorefield High School, saw the light from a distance and thought it was the moon shining on a stream. But the light appears on a part of the mountain where there is no stream. Now, several times the light had chased hunters off the mountain. 2 years ago, 2 men from western Port Maryland were coon hunting on Coal Mountain when something frightened off their dogs. The hunters were looking for the dogs when they saw a strange red light appear a short distance in front of them. Now the light kept coming closer and closer, and all of a sudden, it let out a weird scream and started coming at them faster than before. The men became frightened, and one of them fired 3 times at the light with his shotgun. At that range, it would have been almost impossible to miss, but the light kept coming. The men threw down their weapons and ran as fast as they could. The light chased them off the mountain and then disappeared. On another occasion, a young man took his girlfriend up on the mountain at night. Shortly after they parked the car, a weird red light appeared at the window. The young man had heard of the Coal Mountain Light, but had never believed in it. Thinking someone was trying to play a trick on them, he threw open the door and jumped out, ready for a fight. But there was no one there that he could see, only the light hovering in midair. As he stood there, almost in a state of shock, the light came closer to him, as if to see who he was, and then disappeared. This one here is called The Crying Baby of Holly. Now, during the Depression, a young girl of the neighborhood around Holly River, below Diana in Webster County, gave birth to an illegitimate child. Faced with shame and the task of supporting the child, the girl decided to destroy it. She took the infant and threw it into a hogsty to be gobbled up alive by the vicious hogs. But as it crawled in the mud, the hogs paid it no mind whatsoever. Then the despairing mother took the baby down to the logging mill by the river and thrust it into the deepest water, which was behind the dam and water wheel. Of course, the infant had no chance to survive and drowned in Holly's murky mill pond. Later, the mother hanged herself. Today, the local farm folks in Webster County sometimes report hearing the sound of a crying baby as they pass by the deteriorating old mill late at night. Being somewhat skeptical of such reports, I decided to find out for myself if there was any truth in these stories. Driving to the place and parking my car, I sat and waited for anything that might happen. Sitting there in the light of the full moon, I kept my eyes on the mill pond, which reflected the moon's golden glow. Now a steady mist spiraled up out of the black depths of the ever-flowing water. It was hard to believe that I had fished in this same spot by day and found it quite beautiful in a rugged sort of way. While thinking about the absurdity of the situation, I began to hear a faint noise. Supposing it a feeding trout, I ignored it, but the eerie wail came again, clearer than before, and I suddenly realized that the farm folk weren't just telling a tale. When I heard the crying the 3rd time, there was no keeping me there. Starting up my car and pulling away, I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and the tale come true. There may be a logical explanation for this, but I'm not going to be the one to find out. This one's called A Strange Fire. In a small town in Doddridge County, West Virginia, lived a widow and her daughter. Now, the woman had lost her husband immediately after the birth of their only child. Because there was no one to help raise the child, the widow considered her daughter a loathsome burden. Now, as the years passed, the child grew to be a beautiful young girl. All the young ladies of the community were envious of her popularity. But because her mother had given her no moral instruction, she knew nothing about the perils of such popularity except what other girls had told her. One day, a handsome young serviceman came into town. The beautiful young girl chanced to meet him on the street, and a romance blossomed. But like many young servicemen, all he wanted was a good time. After he had his fling, he left town. A few months later, the girl discovered that she was carrying the soldier's child. Her mother soon knew it too and was enraged. She condemned her daughter for the very things she had failed to warn her against. Now the widow, terrified that someone might hear about the girl, locked her daughter in a room in the attic and posted a sign on the door of the house warning that her daughter was sick with smallpox. But somehow, everyone heard the news anyway, and the tale spread, as rumors do. Now, after the baby was born, the widow took it into another room of the attic and asphyxiated it by turning on a small gas stove near where the baby was lying. That night, she carried its body to the edge of a field nearby and buried it under a fence post. The following evening, two women were walking along the road near the widow's house. As they neared the field where the baby was buried, a huge ball of fire rolled down the hillside, crossed the road and field, and stopped below the fence post. The women, startled by such a strange thing, but curious too, went over to the fence where the ball of fire had stopped. By the time they reached the post, the ball of fire had disappeared, but they noticed the loose dirt at the base of the fence. One of the women dug into the soil with her hands, and they found the baby's body and ran to get their husbands. When they returned with the men, the body was no longer there. Since they had heard the rumors about the young girl, they decided to go to the house and question her. They knocked on the door, but no one answered. All the blinds were drawn and the house was locked up tight. No one ever returned to the house, but a tiny new grave was found in a church graveyard nearby. Many children who have played near the old deserted house have said they could hear a baby crying from within, but no one ever entered. All right, y'all. This one here is called Jones's Hollow, or Holler if you're a hillbilly like me. I'm trying to go proper, though, so I've been decent for now. Now, there is a small settlement near Bellington called Union. It is situated on top of a hill that towers over the Tygart Valley River. There are valleys and hollows between the many hills of the region, and each hollow, or holler, has its own name. Now, Jones's Hollow has not only a name, but also a legend. Almost 75 years ago, a very rough man named Abraham Jones bought some land in this area. He drank heavily and gambled with some of the lowest class of people at that time. There was another family in the community named Johnson. Now, Hubert Johnson was almost as vile a man as Jones. He had a daughter named Rachel. One evening during a poker game, Johnson ran out of money and, having nothing else to bet, put up his daughter as stakes. Now, Jones won his wife Rachel on Saturday night, and they were married on Sunday. Abraham and Rachel had 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. Each day, Abraham became more harsh. He soon grew to hate his children. He hated them so much that he wanted to kill them. Now, one day, when he was drunk, he took the 3 children to a cave, chained them to a wall, and left them there to die. Now, people believed that if a woman who was barren would hear the cries of the children, find the cave where they were chained, and free them, she would be able to have 3 children of her own. More than half a century later, Russell and Laura Coleridge moved into a cottage in Jones's Hollow. Now, they were a happy couple, except for the fact that Laura was unable to have children. Now, people often said that on windy nights, they could still hear the cries of the forsaken Joneses children, but nobody was able to find the cave. Now, one evening, as a storm approached, Laura could hear what sounded like the cries of children. Anxious for their safety, she searched the woods surrounding the cottage. Quite by accident, she came upon the cave, and by entering, freed the spirits of the children. A year later, Laura had her first child. This one's called Who Was Guilty? Children in the 19th century were more often seen than heard. After a hard day's work in the cornfield under the hot summer sun, they were usually ready to retire as soon as the evening meal was over. Millard, my great-grandfather, was no exception. Early one spring evening, as the yellow moon crept over the mountaintops, he was awakened by the rumbling of a horse-drawn wagon as it thumped over the dirt road in front of the house. He peered out the window and was astonished to see a Negro man being dragged behind an old cart. Inquisitiveness filled every fiber of his body until he could stand it no longer. He pulled on some clothes and rushed out the back door. As he tagged behind the men, he was able to pick up pieces of their conversation. Jock, the Negro man, had been accused of raping and mutilating the body of a young white girl, a neighboring farmer's daughter. Now the farmer had found him standing over the body, his hands dripping with blood. Jock swore that he was innocent, but since he had worked but a short time as a hired hand, no one believed his story. Now he stated that he had found the girl lying between the house and the barn. Thinking that she needed help, he had stopped to give his assistance. And as he bent over the body, her father came out of the house and assumed the worst. Now tempers flared, and before Jock knew what was happening, the local farmers had him convicted and on the way to the apple orchard to be hanged. No one heard his explanations as he begged for his life. The wagon was placed beneath the largest tree, and a rope was knotted about his neck. As the horse pulled the wagon from beneath him, his last words rang loud and clear. "I am innocent." Later, the same spring, all but one tree in the apple orchard withered and died. Now it stands alone, bearing fruit that is envied by every farmer for miles around. If one visits the orchard on the anniversary of the hanging, he can hear the faint voice of Jock calling, "I am innocent." This one here is called the Cook family. Now Paul and Bill Harris were riding home from church in their buggy, Surrey, and began talking of the legend of the Cook family. Now the Cooks had been pioneers, and the entire family had been massacred on top of Cherry Hill on their way home from prayer meeting in 1865. It was said that the Cooks had tried again and again to reach their home over Cherry Hill. As the Harrises were driving along, the boys noticed a man, a woman, and some children walking along the road in front of the buggy. Now, overtaking the family, Paul offered them a ride. The tall gentleman thanked them, and the happy group got in. The father spoke normally of the crops, weather, and the general conditions. Now, when they reached the top of the hill, the mother suggested that they walk from there. And one after another, they climbed out, thanking the brothers for the ride. As the brothers started to leave, Bill suddenly remembered that they had not asked the family's name, and he called to the little boy who was lagging behind. As he followed his family over the hill, the child replied cheerfully that his name was Jonathan Cook. This one here is the ghosts of the mine horses. Now, in the coal mines of 50 or 60 years ago, horses did much of the hauling that is now done by machinery. Each morning, many horses were taken down the slope entrance into the mine, there to stand and wait until the men filled some cars with coal in the rooms. The horses would then pull the cars out of the rooms and onto the main heading. At quitting time, the horses would be unharnessed and taken back out the slope and from there to the big barn that the coal company maintained. Often, they would just be let loose there in the mine, and away they would go, up the slope, along the path, across the bridge, and onto the barn unaccompanied. When the big explosion of 1907 occurred in old number 6 and number 8 mines in Monongah, a great many faithful horses, as well as hundreds of brave men, perished instantly. There were 8 sections in old number 6, and each section was approximately a mile square. In just one crosscut in one section halfway up in third right of old number 6, at least 12 horses perished, and some said many more. These horses had been put in the crosscut to wait until the loaders filled some cars for them to pull. When the explosion came, the pressure from both ends of the crosscut pressed and squeezed the horses into one solid mass of flesh and bone. When rescue workers could enter the mine, naturally their first concern was to locate and remove the remains of human victims and make identification checks. This was such a tremendous and sorrowful task that at the time not too much thought was given to the bodies of the beasts of burden. When the rescue and cleanup crews came upon the big mass of 12 horses, it was decided that the best and quickest disposal that could be made was to gob their remains into an old working area and seal it off. A few years after the explosion, several other men and I were working in this part of the mine where the horses had perished. Having half an hour off for lunch, we would find a place along the rib and sit on a pile of slack while we were eating. This would take about 15 minutes. Then we would have 15 minutes to nap or usually just rest before resuming work. There would then be almost complete quiet in the mine, and we would distinctly hear the galloping sound of hoofbeats. Gradually, the sounds would become louder as they approached nearer and nearer to where we were. Now, the sounds came galloping down the heading in 3rd North, hoofs cracking hard on the pavement or floor of the mine, loping right upon us. We would shrink back as far as we could against the rib as the flying hoofs loped on by, the sounds finally fading in the distance. All of us in that section heard these horses not just once, but many, many times. Maybe once a week, maybe twice or 3 times a week over a long period of time. And none of us ever doubted that they were actual horses that galloped by, even though they were not visible to the mortal eye. We were awake and sober when we heard the sounds increasing and receding, and we knew instinctively that the clatter was made by the horses that had perished in the explosion. No man who heard the sounds could be convinced then or now that such things were impossible. Does one doubt the existence of the wind, be it in the form of a gentle breeze or a tornado, just because it cannot be seen by human eye? This one here is called The Ghost of Old Ben. Now, years ago, 7 brothers moved to Granttown to live and earn money in the coal mines. Now, the oldest brother was called Ben. Ben and his brothers were very healthy, strong, and happy. They usually sat around the house after they finished working, where they ate, drank, and talked of the old country. Now, Ben, being the oldest, more or less took care of the younger ones. These brothers were very close to each other. They even worked in the same section together, Section 8 Main. As time passed, most of them married and had children, but they were still very close and all lived in Granttown. Now, during this time, one had to be extra careful in the mines, since there was many accidents and deaths. The men had to carry lamps instead of having lights on their caps as they do today. One day, upon entering the section, Ben tripped over an old log and was killed instantly. The others felt somewhat lost without their oldest brother, but they had to go on living and taking care of their families. Now, 1 year after Ben's death, the brothers were working near Section 8 Main. Suddenly, a big gust of wind came and blew out their lamps. There they stood in complete darkness, not knowing what had happened. At that moment, the youngest one heard something and told the others to listen carefully. When they heard the noise, a big rumble from above, they all hit the ground and covered their heads with their arms. Then suddenly, there was a cave-in. A few seconds later, they stood up and tried to feel their way around, but they could find no exit. They were sealed in to spend the last moments of their lives. All at once, one of them saw a light on his left, which seemed to be off in the far distance, and he pointed it out to the others. Soon the light took the form of their oldest brother, Ben, and they heard a weird voice calling, "Follow me, brothers, follow me." The 6 brothers followed old Ben until they came to another section, where men were gathered in astonishment. These men said that it was impossible for anyone to have escaped from the section where the brothers had been working. But the brothers told them of old Ben's ghost leading them through the tunnel, since they had no lights. But when they took the other men to this tunnel, the exit was sealed completely by the cave-in.